You have no right to display our logo. We will sue you until you don't have a single cent left to your name." Thaddeus Quill, the high-priced attorney for Apexion Motors, slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the oil-stained wooden counter. The sound echoed through the dusty, cramped repair shop like a gunshot. Thaddeus stood there in his charcoal-gray Italian suit, looking around the garage with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He adjusted his silk tie, his eyes flickering with the cold, calculated arrogance of a man who had never done a day of manual labor in his life. Harlan Hatch Vacek didn't even look up. The 78-year-old mechanic, his face etched with deep lines like the bark of an ancient oak tree, continued to meticulously wipe down a precision-engineered carburetor with a rag that had seen more grease than the lawyer had seen sunlight. Outside, the Wyoming wind whipped against the corrugated metal walls, but inside, the air was heavy with the metallic tang of history and the faint, sweet scent of gasoline. "This logo?" Hatch asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, like stones grinding against one another deep beneath the earth. "I painted that sign myself before you were even a glimmer of ambition in your father's eye, son." Thaddeus stepped closer, his polished leather shoes leaving faint tracks in the fine layer of shop dust. He jabbed a manicured finger toward the faded, hand-painted emblem hanging above the workbench. "That is the proprietary intellectual property of Apexion Motors. Your original franchise agreement expired 30 years ago. As of tomorrow, if that sign is still hanging, our demolition crew will be here to turn this scrap heap into a parking lot." Hatch finally stopped his work. He slowly set down the carburetor, wiped his calloused hands on his shop apron, and stood up straight. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He simply looked at the lawyer with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of countless men just like him. It was a cold, stoic gaze. The kind that makes a man realize he is standing on the edge of a cliff without knowing it. "You should be careful, Quill," Hatch said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "There are some things, once you decide to pry them open, that result in a lot more than just a dispute over a piece of wood and paint." "Are you sure you want to open this box?" Thaddeus Quill let out a sharp, dry laugh that sounded more like a cough. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a gold-plated pen, and tapped it against the surface of the legal notice. "The only thing inside that box, Mr. Vacek, is your retirement or your bankruptcy. Apexion Motors is building the largest logistics hub in the Pacific Northwest, right here in Blackwood Creek. We've bought the diner, we've bought the hardware store, and we've bought every acre of dirt between here and the interstate. You're the last holdout. This isn't a movie where the old man wins. This is reality. And in reality, the corporation always owns the land." He turned on his heel, his shoes clicking sharply against the concrete floor as he walked toward the exit. He didn't look back at the row of vintage engines lined up like silent soldiers against the wall, nor did he notice the hand-tooled leather grip on Hatch's favorite wrench. To Quill, this place was just a pile of rusted metal and obsolete dreams. He climbed into his sleek black electric sedan, the silent motor a stark contrast to the throaty rumble of the engines Hatch spent his days breathing back to life. Hatch stood in the doorway, watching the dust settle on the gravel road. Blackwood Creek was changing. The town used to be a place where a handshake meant more than a 100-page contract. Now it was being swallowed by a giant that didn't have a soul, only a balance sheet. The valley was beautiful, surrounded by the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Grand Tetons, but the air felt thinner now, choked by the looming shadow of progress. He walked back into the shop and sat on his stool, the leather worn thin by decades of use. He poured himself a cup of coffee from a tarnished thermos, black, bitter, and hot. He looked at the walls. Every tool had a place. Every stain on the floor told a story of a machine saved from the scrap heap. Hatch wasn't a man of many words. He believed that if you took care of a machine, it would take care of you. He believed that a man's word was his bond, and he believed that some things were simply not for sale. Have you ever felt like a small gear trying to stop a massive machine from grinding you down? Most of us work hard, keep our promises, and try to live with a bit of dignity, only to find the system trying to steamroll us for a few extra dollars of profit. If you believe that integrity still matters in this world, and if you've ever wanted to see the underdog finally bite back, then hit that subscribe button. We're not here to watch the powerful bully the weak. We're here to see what happens when the weak have a secret that the powerful are too arrogant to see. The sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long purple shadows across the shop floor. Hatch didn't go home. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't even turn on the lights. He sat in the fading glow, thinking about 1974. He thought about a young man named Barnaby Apexion, a man who arrived in this valley with nothing but a broken-down truck and a dream of building the world's most reliable engine. Back then, Hatch was the only one who believed in him. Hatch was the one who provided the parts, the tools, and the space for Barnaby to build his first prototype. They were brothers in grease and steel. But time does strange things to men. It turns dreams into empires, and empires turn men into monsters of greed. Barnaby was long gone, but the company that bore his name had become a predator. Hatch reached into his pocket and felt the cold iron of a small key. It was time to go into the back room. It was time to find the one thing he had promised never to use unless the world truly lost its way. The back room of the shop was a sanctuary of shadows, smelling of cedar wood and old oil. Hatch moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who knew exactly where every floorboard creaked. He reached under a heavy workbench, his fingers searching for a hidden latch behind a row of vintage service manuals. With a faint click, a small section of the floorboards pivoted. He pulled out a heavy iron box, its surface pitted with rust. It didn't look like much, just a relic of a bygone era. But as Hatch blew the thick layer of dust off the lid, the moonlight caught the faint engraving of a gear and a lightning bolt, the original forgotten mark of Barnaby Apexion. He didn't rush. He sat on a wooden crate and pulled a small iron key from his pocket. The lock groaned as he turned it, a sound like a heavy gate opening after decades of being barred. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the Wyoming dampness, sat a single leather-bound folder. Hatch pulled out a stack of papers, their edges yellowed like old bone. His eyes scanned the handwritten lines. It was a partnership agreement, dated October 12, 1974. It wasn't written in the legalese of modern-day sharks. It was written in the plain, honest English of two men who shared a dream and a bottle of cheap rye whiskey. He remembered that night. The wind had been howling just like it was now. Barnaby had been desperate, his prototype engine failing, his investors walking away. Hatch had given him his last $5,000 and the keys to this shop. In return, Barnaby had insisted on writing a contract that would protect Hatch forever. At the time, they had laughed about it, thinking it was just a gesture of friendship. They didn't know that Barnaby's engine would one day power a third of the vehicles on the continent. Hatch's finger traced the signature at the bottom, Barnaby Apexion. Beside it was a wax seal, a relic of Barnaby's old-fashioned sense of drama. But it was Clause 7 that mattered now. Hatch read it twice, his lips thinning into a hard line. This facility shall serve as the honorary lifetime service station for all Apexion developments. Should the corporation ever seek to terminate this presence without the owner's written consent, the global rights to the brand's original trademark and all derivative logos shall immediately revert to the shop owner. It was a poison pill buried in the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar empire. A failsafe designed by a man who, at the time, had nothing but his honor. The next morning, the sun rose over the Tetons like a bruised orange. Hatch didn't put on his shop apron. He went to the small living quarters upstairs, shaved with a straight razor, and put on his only white shirt, crisp, starched, and smelling of laundry soap. He tucked the yellowed folder into his inner coat pocket and stepped out into the morning air. He didn't take his truck. He walked. He walked past the under-construction signs of the new logistics hub. He walked past the excavators that were already idling at the edge of his property line, their metal teeth glinting in the morning light. The workers watched him go, a solitary figure in a faded coat, walking with a steady, unbreakable rhythm toward the glass and steel monolith that was the regional headquarters of Apexion Motors. The building was a fortress of vanity. Polished marble floors, glass walls that reflected the mountains they were destroying, and security guards who looked like they were auditioning for a private militia. "Can I help you, sir?" the receptionist asked, her voice synthetic and hollow. She looked at Hatch's worn boots and his weathered face as if he were a ghost haunting a modern art gallery. "I have an appointment with Thaddeus Quill," Hatch said. "Mr. Quill is in a board meeting. He doesn't see anyone without—" Hatch didn't wait for her to finish. He walked toward the elevator. "Sir!" "You can't go up there," she shouted, but Hatch was already inside. He pressed the button for the top floor. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel excitement. He felt like a man who was about to finish a job he started 50 years ago. The elevator doors opened directly into a boardroom. A dozen men and women in suits were seated around a table made of African mahogany. At the head of the table was the CEO, a man named Sterling Vance, whose face was as smooth and soulless as a river stone. Thaddeus Quill was standing at a digital projector, pointing at a map of Blackwood Creek. Quill stopped mid-sentence as Hatch walked into the room. A smirk spread across the lawyer's face. "Mr. Vacek," Quill said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I told you we'd be bringing the machines today. Did you come here to sign the surrender papers? You're a little late for a graceful exit." Hatch didn't say a word. He walked to the center of the room, the silence stretching out until it became heavy, uncomfortable. The board members shifted in their seats. There was something about the old man's presence, a weight, a stillness that made the high-tech room feel fragile. Hatch reached into his coat, pulled out the yellowed folder, and placed it on the mahogany table. He slid it toward Sterling Vance. "I'm not here to sign your papers," Hatch said, his voice quiet but carrying the force of a mountain slide. "I'm here to show you why you're going to move your machines off my land. Now." The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind Hatch Vacek, the sound final and resonant like the closing of a tomb. For exactly 5 seconds, the boardroom of Apexion Motors remained as silent as a vacuum. Then, the atmosphere didn't just break, it detonated. Sterling Vance, the CEO whose face had been the picture of corporate invincibility, looked down at the yellowed 1974 agreement as if it were a live grenade. His hands, usually steady enough to sign billion-dollar mergers without a tremor, were shaking so violently that the paper rattled. Thaddeus Quill, the high-priced predator who had entered the room with the swagger of a conqueror, was now slumped against the African mahogany table, his face the color of wet ash. "Is it real?" Vance hissed, his voice a jagged whisper. "Tell me that old man is lying. Tell me he's a lunatic with a printer and a dream." Quill didn't look up. He was staring at the wax seal of Barnaby Apexion, the founder's personal mark. The registration numbers matched the 1974 Wyoming State Archives. Quill stammered, his throat clicking as he swallowed. I checked the digital backup on my tablet while he was talking. "It's not just real, Sterling. It's ironclad. Barnaby didn't just give him a shop. He gave him the heart of the company. If we touch a single brick of his garage, the trademark rights revert to him. Globally, every car, every billboard, every dealership from here to Tokyo would belong to a man who smells like diesel and old tobacco." The board members, people who measured their worth in private jets and offshore accounts, began to panic. They knew the math. If the market found out that Apexion Motors didn't legally own its own name, the stock would plummet 40% before the opening bell. The logistics hub, the mergers, their bonuses, it was all built on a foundation of sand, and Hatch Vacek was the tide coming in. While the corporate world was burning in that glass tower, Hatch was walking. He walked back through the town of Blackwood Creek, his boots steady on the asphalt. He passed the diner where the closed sign had been hanging for weeks. He passed the hardware store where the windows had been boarded up. He didn't look like a man who had just brought a Titan to its knees. He looked like a man going home to finish a job. 2 hours later, the silence of the valley was broken. It wasn't the sound of demolition, but the sound of retreat. The massive yellow excavators that had been idling at Hatch's property line began to roar, but they weren't moving forward. They were backing up. The workers, confused and frustrated, began loading the metal teeth of the machines back onto flatbed trailers. The corporate supervisors, who had been barking orders all morning, were now huddled over their phones, their faces pale as they received the frantic orders from the top floor. By sunset, the heavy machinery was gone. The dust settled, leaving the valley in a state of stunned peace. The legal settlement was finalized 48 hours later in a quiet office, far from the cameras. Apexion Motors didn't just stop the eviction, they folded. They had no choice. The terms were dictated not by a team of lawyers, but by a man who knew the value of a promise. The corporation paid $7 million in backdated royalties, a friendship fee that had been compounding since the 70s. But Hatch didn't stop there. He forced them to sign over the deeds of the town diner and the hardware store, returning them to the families who had been bullied into selling. He made them fund a 20-year endowment for the local school district. And then there was Thaddeus Quill. A week later, the lawyer was seen sitting in his black electric sedan in a parking lot 10 miles outside of town. He had been fired, erased from the firm's website as if he had never existed. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his gold-plated pen was gone. He sat in the silence of his car, looking at the mountains, realizing that for all his education and all his cunning, he had been outplayed by a man who used a wrench as a scepter. He had mistaken Hatch's silence for weakness, and it had cost him his world. As for Sterling Vance, the resignation came in a short, cold press release. The board of directors couldn't risk the story of the 1974 agreement ever reaching the public, so they buried Vance to save the brand. He left the building with a single box of belongings, escorted by security guards who didn't even look him in the eye. Back at the shop, the world returned to its proper rhythm. The Vacek's mechanical sign, with its hand-painted Apexion logo, was still there. Hatch didn't replace it with a neon one. He didn't paint the building or pave the gravel lot. He went back to the back room, took the 1974 agreement, and placed it back into the iron box. He locked it and slid it under the floorboards. It was a weapon he hoped he would never have to draw again. The money changed everyone in Blackwood Creek except for the man who had won it. The town diner reopened, the smell of bacon and fresh coffee wafting through the morning air once more. The hardware store took the boards off its windows. The future home of Apexion signs were burned in a bonfire by the local high schoolers. Hatch used his wealth like he used his tools, with precision and purpose. He built a vocational center at the edge of town, a place where kids who didn't fit into the world of spreadsheets and boardrooms could come to learn the honest weight of a hammer and the logic of an engine. He didn't put his name on the building. He named it after Barnaby, the man Barnaby used to be before the money got to him. One evening, about a month after the showdown, Hatch sat on the wooden bench in front of his shop. He poured a cup of coffee from his tarnished thermos, the liquid dark and strong. The sun was dipping behind the Grand Tetons, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. He looked down at his hands. They were stained with oil that would never truly wash out, the skin like old leather, the knuckles swollen from decades of labor. He wasn't thinking about the millions in the bank. He was thinking about a 1968 Mustang that was coming in tomorrow with a fuel line leak. People think that power is found in the height of a skyscraper or the number of zeros in a bank account. They think that being loud makes you important. But real power, the kind that moves mountains and stops machines, is found in the quiet corners of the world. It's found in the man who keeps his receipts, the man who keeps his word, and the man who knows that some things are worth more than a payout. Hatch took a sip of his coffee. The air was turning cold, the mountain breeze carrying the scent of pine and the promise of winter. He looked up at his sign one last time before turning off the shop lights. The logo was faded, the paint peeling at the edges, but in the twilight it looked more solid than any skyscraper in the city. The world would continue to spin. Other corporations would come, other lawyers would try their luck, and the tide of progress would continue to beat against the shore. But for now, in this small corner of Wyoming, the giant had been reminded of a simple truth. You can buy a man's land, you can buy his time, and you can even buy his silence. But you can never ever buy his soul. The stoic hero doesn't need a monument. He doesn't need a parade. He just needs a well-calibrated machine and a clear conscience. And as Hatch Vacek walked into his small living quarters and shut the door, the valley fell into a deep, peaceful silence. A silence that had been earned through 50 years of integrity and a single sheet of yellowed paper. If this story reminded you that the truth has a weight that no amount of money can lift, then we've done our job. Always remember, keep your tools clean, your mind sharp, and your promises written in ink that won't fade. Because you never know when the world will come knocking, and you'll need to show them exactly who you are.